Welcome to Adding Value, the show for property owners facing the big decision. Sell as is or add value for a better return on investment. To find the answers, it's our resident auctioneer Barnsey from Auction Outcomes.
Welcome to Adding Value. Today we're fortunate to have Hamish Firth from the Mount Hobson Group, and he's going to help us try and demystify the unitary plan and give us some ideas of what can and can't be achieved with your piece of land and some good solid advice. So Hamish, can you in a nutshell tell us what the Mount Hobson Group does for people?
If you need a piece of paper from the council, if you need a permit or a resource consent or a licence, our job is to procure that for you. So to take you through that process of application through to an approval.
People can engage with you rather than actually going directly to the council themselves?
Oh, absolutely. We're very happy to take calls with people who might have a site where there's development potential and to show them whether there is flooding or whether there's services, whether they've got the right zone, and then provide them a range of options. And the council probably won't provide you that range of options because their job is probably to tell you what the rules are.
Do you want to take us through the journey of how you got to Mount Hobson Group?
Yeah, very briefly. I went to Auckland University, finished up with a master's in planning practice. I worked for the council for about 2 years, yep. And I probably didn't fit so well. The rules there were treated as an absolute, and I treat rules as a guide generally. I then I was fortunate to go and work for a developer for a couple of years, so I understood the direct other side of the coin. And then I set up my own consultancy business around the year 2000, Mount Hobson Group, and we've been providing that sort of service to people, getting resource consents, building consents, liquor licences, street trading permits, whatever else the council wants to require us to do for a greater part of 21, 22 years. So yeah, and we've been through different district plans and different governments and different regimes, and we work mainly in Auckland, but we work all over the country.
I'm getting the feeling that Mount Hobson Group, in general, the unitary plan seems to be working, so there probably won't be much change in the near future, in your opinion?
Yeah, the unitary plan is a very good guiding document. I think there'll be small changes around the edges, but the fundamentals of housing supply will be met by the provisions of the unitary plan.
So Hamish, what's the history of the district plan and how it came to morph its way and obviously have changes and become the unitary plan? And obviously, there used to be 4 councils and then we got the super city. How did that all come about?
Very good question. As a planner, and I've been doing this for over 20 years, if we cross the boundary from Waitakere to Rodney, or from Rodney into North Shore, or from North Shore into Auckland City, or from Auckland City back into Manukau, every one of those areas had a different district plan, a different set of rules, a different set of objectives. It may have differed slightly, but there would have been different rules around pipe sizes and curb widths and all of that. And I think what it created was a dysfunction in the Auckland region where every part of Auckland was competing against another. And you probably saw that most when it came time to build a stadium. Rodney and Manukau said we're not paying, or the North Shore said, well, we're not paying for the zoo because it's in Auckland City, but all of Auckland used it. So through a process, Rodney Hyde was the driver, we got the Auckland Super City. And a lot of people thought it wasn't a good idea. Look, for me, I think it was a fantastic idea because it created efficiencies. It said from Warkworth in the north to Pukekohe in the south, from Muriwai in the west to Maraetai in the east, you had a region that functioned as one. So whether it was bus routes, whether it was the provision of services, whether it was parks, or more importantly, whether it was a unitary plan or a district plan, there was one set of rules for the whole region. Yeah. So after the Super City was enacted, they then, after a period of time, a couple of years, decided they wanted one plan to represent all of them. At the same time, you had a housing shortage, and it was in the media every single day. There was no supply, what are we going to do? So it was the then national government that really put pressure on Auckland Council to say, what is the problem? The problem is, Auckland is a growing area, people want to live here. So how are we going to solve it? Because we can't keep going out. We can't keep spreading. And there was rumours that you'd end up in Hamilton. Now, you never would. But what most important is that sprawl creates more and more problems. It costs more to put infrastructure in. You end up with longer commute times. So what they came up with is that there's going to be 1 million more people living in Auckland by 2040. We had to work backwards and say, how are we going to accommodate these people? And there was a real paradigm shift. And whether it was the national government at the time putting tremendous pressure on Auckland Council, but also Auckland Council responding by getting in a range of experts who said, what are we going to do? And the key paradigm shift was the deletion of the density control. Density was 1 unit per certain amount of land area. 1 unit per 300, 1 unit per 400, 1 unit per 500. The moment they deleted that, they created land. So they created land vertically by allowing higher height limits. Terrace house and apartment, for example, you can go 5 levels. Before, all of that land would have been allowed 2 levels. Mixed housing urban, you can go 11 metres or 3 levels. So you created land vertically, but you also got rid of this constraint of 1 house per 300, 1 per 400. So you could put smaller units on. Smaller units cost less. They fit a market, a first home buyer market. So what the previous district plans did, which is clearly different from the unitary plan, is they had density controls. So development sites became rarer and rarer because you're only allowed so many houses per square metres of land. What the unitary plan has done is taken away that density control. So it's no longer governed by how many houses per square metre you can have. Rather, it's governed by controls of outlook, height, and bulk and location. And also in there is urban design. So council wants good urban design outcomes, good built form outcomes. So you want north facing yards as much as possible. You want good pedestrian and streetscape amenity. So what the unitary plan has done is it's said to landowners, you choose how many units you put here to fit what the market might be. So if you were close to a railway station, it may be no car parking. So in the terrace house and apartment zone, you don't need to provide car parks. And there's a logic and a reason for that, because the terrace house and apartment zone is generally close to centres of work and centres of transport.
Okay.
What the other 2 zones have done, the mixed housing suburban and urban have done, is also allowed for flexibility in the typology of unit. So if you went out to a place like Flatbush in the past, you allowed 1 house per, say, 300 square metres. So the sections got more and more expensive. So the houses, large-scale houses, filled the entire area of land, 1 house. On that same site now, you might fit 2 houses or you might fit 4 apartments. So you're building to what the market wants and you're responding more to your location. So the unitary plan is much more flexible. It has outcomes in mind rather than prescriptive densities.
So hopefully the unitary plan is going to help free up the land as you've discussed.
Yeah, but I would suggest to you that before, if I went to a site that was for sale, the description, if it was a development site, might be rear as hen's teeth. The opposite is now the case. So as long as a site doesn't have severe flooding, isn't steep and can be serviced, generally speaking, it has development potential. So we have gone from having very few available development sites to having more than we need at the moment. So the only thing that stands in the way generally is serviceability.
And that's power, water, sewerage?
Stormwater, sewerage, topography and flooding are the main things. So there's plenty of land around, especially in Point Chev, very, very flat, which has development potential, which actually means you're going to see a change in how these suburbs look over time. And you're starting to see it now with finished developments. So what an 800 square metre site may have had 1 house. It might have up to 6, 7 or 8 houses now. It might have 2 or 3 depending on what the market is. But you're going to see a distinctive change over the next 10 to 15 years as the development potential of each site is taken up.
We were talking earlier about Point Chev and saying that was a very good example of a suburb where the unitary plan's working really well. Can you talk us through that?
Yeah, it's one of those ones where there is an obvious layout to the 3 main residential zones that allow for development. The unitary plan is very enabling. So it in a way was put in place to solve Auckland's housing shortage. Not a crisis, but a shortage where it was very hard to enable more housing. So the unitary plan looked forward to 2040 and said we're going to have 1 million more people. How are we going to fit them within the urban boundary of Auckland? And what they did is they created 3 main residential zones. Mixed housing suburban, which is shown as yellow, mixed housing urban, which is shown as brown, and terrace house and apartments, which is shown as orange. Mixed housing suburban makes up probably 60% of the city zone, and Point Chev is the same. It's usually in that more suburban area. Mixed housing urban is the brown colour, usually down arterials, and then terrace house and apartments which allows for up to 4, 5 and 6 level apartment buildings, is around town centres. So if you have a look at the unitary plan zoning map for Point Chev, you'll see that clear distinction. What you'll also see that's important is 90% of Point Chev has been enabled for additional development potential by those 3 zones.
When we look at the different zones, and we spoke earlier, and you mentioned several of them then, single house zone, single house lot says to me, just as reading it, I'd think, oh, well, it's just one house on one piece of land. But you said that's not actually the case, and you shouldn't judge a book by its cover or its title.
A book by its title, yeah. Single house zone implies that. So the first thing we say is, generally speaking, you're allowed one house per 600 square metres of land. But on that 600 square metres of land, you're also allowed a minor dwelling unit. That's a up to 2 bedrooms and 65 square metre minor or small dwelling. You're also allowed to cut the existing house into 2, so if you had an old villa or bungalow, you could put 2 flats into there. And more importantly, you could create, as a permitted activity, visitor accommodation for up to 10 people, or a care centre for the elderly, or a care centre for young children for up to 10 people as well.
Wow.
As a permitted activity. So there are a greater range of activities that are permitted in the single house zone than just a single house. Granted, you're not likely to see large scale development on smaller single house zone sites, but the title single house is a misnomer to what could be done on that zone.
Quite different to the way I would, and I think the average person would interpret it by going on the council website or popping in there.
Yeah, the zone doesn't stop development, but what it wants to retain is a spaciousness. Yep. There aren't many single house areas in Auckland, and what they wanted to retain generally was a character of spaciousness.
Can you tell us about a project you've done recently?
Yep, absolutely. So we've just we finished doing a resource consent for a site in Henderson. It was about 1,400 square metres. It was at 20 James Laurie Ave in Henderson. What the developer decided to do was to retain the existing house and move it forward, and then build 8 2-bedroom, 2-level townhouses at the back. We got that consent the early part of 2020, and I can say, as we speak now, that development is now finished. Most of those units have been sold and people are moving in. So from that inception, which would have been the very beginning of last year, to the lodgement and the approval of that consent through to finishing was probably about 18 months. So 7 or 8 month build and sort of 9 to 11 months to get all the consents, the resource consent, the subdivision consent, the building consent and the engineering approval. So that development is now finished. So it's a real working example of the unitary plan at work. And previously, under the old Waitakere district plan, we might have got 2, maybe 3 units. So what you're seeing is a doubling and in some cases a tripling of the densities or the amount of units we can fit on compared to the previous district plans. So the unitary plan is very enabling.
So with that development, and you've said what they achieved, which is quite amazing. Under the older plan, would it have taken longer to get consent?
We would never have got a consent for that type of development, ever. We would never have tried. It would have been too hard, it would have been notified, and it would have been opposed by council planners.
Well, yeah, that's the unitary plan working, isn't it?
So what it was that there was never a shortage of land, because what they've created is they've created more land by creating more sites. They've created land vertically, and they've created land horizontally. So before you had a restriction, how many houses per square metre, now you've taken that away. So you've taken away that impediment to development potential, and you've also taken away what we used to do was just keep spreading out. So now we're able to redevelop existing what we call brownfield sites, and they can be redeveloped. And in this case, the existing dwelling was retained. So you've created different typologies, you've created different housing types for different people in different parts of the market. So those 2-bedroom terrace houses were probably mainly for first home buyers and entry level. The existing house was probably more for an established family. It's got 3 to 4 bedrooms. It's got a larger section, much smaller than what it had at 1,400 square metres, but much more usable and user friendly for a family, a busy family.
8 apartments went into the back. Is that
8
correct?
terraces went on the back. Yes.
So that's 9
units.
9 dwellings.
Where under the previous scheme we would have got district plan, we may have got 3. For me, the most important thing about property, especially being a first-home buyer, is the moment you've made your first purchase, if the market rises, you're rising with it.
Yeah.
And so the more we can provide supply and to me supply is the biggest impediment. It's economics 101. I think Auckland Council with the unitary plan has done a very good job of it. I also think that the unitary plan should be rolled out in almost every other small, medium and large town in New Zealand, almost as a blueprint of how you would provide supply. And once you provide supply, you create an equilibrium, especially at that lower first home buyer level.
No.
Look, the unitary plan does have some downsides. You're going to have infrastructure constraints, and that's infrastructure in terms of capacity, and you're also going to have transport constraints because you're going to have more and more people living and using their cars and having to get to work. So it is a silver bullet in terms of housing, but in terms of overall land use planning, you're going to get more congestion. And look, then people either have to shift modes of work or they have to find an alternative way to get to work every day.
Absolutely.
Because let's take Point Chev, you've probably got an ability to triple the population of that township, that suburb. So that means the shops are far more viable, but it also means you're going to have a whole lot more traffic. You're going to have more pressure on schools, you're going to have pressure on parks, you're going to have pressure on infrastructure. I don't think that's been thought through, but we've solved the housing supply problem in Auckland.
So Hamish, we've chatted about Point Chev as an area. I happen to live there as well, which is kind of funny. And I am seeing a change with the landscape and the way things look. You know, you drive down the main road and you can see the multi-level developments being put up. When do you think the unitary plan will really, show itself in the Auckland market and we're going to see a dramatic change in the landscape of areas like Te Atatu, Point Chev, and areas that lend themselves well to the new unitary plan?
It's very interesting. I think it'll be progressive and it'll be over the next 10 to 15 years. So you're not suddenly going to see every single site being developed. As demand arises, as people will sell, as people want to move into an area, that's when you'll see that change happening. There are some streets, Glen Innes for an example, where 50 or 60% of the sites in those streets now have been redeveloped with the unitary plan in mind. And what you'll probably find with the other ones, that they're either people who don't want to sell, where there's flooding, or where there's no services. So you're always going to have people who want to remain on a single site with, say, 800 square metres, because that's where they want to live and that's what they want, and they're not worried about profiting from or moving from that area. They can't replace what they've got. You'll also have sites which it's uneconomic to service them. The stormwater may not be available, there may be no public sewer. So you're going to see a gradual change, but you'll never see a complete uptake from the unitary plan due to that site constraint, that servicing constraint of every site.
So the services, obviously, as you said, are crucial. If somebody had a site in mind or looking to buy a site or was currently on a site, they could come to you and ask, how difficult is this going to be to get services? Or
yeah, absolutely. And the first thing we will do, and we provide that it's an honest answer, there's no point in pushing things uphill, the proverbial, if it can't be done. So the first thing we're going to look for is the access and availability of public stormwater and public sewer. And if they are not available, what is the alternative? And if there is no alternative or no economic alternative, at the moment it's best to say you don't really have a developable site. No. And there are quite a few sites in Auckland which are constrained by a lack of access to public services.
If you're living in a house and right next door the bulldozers come in and they clear the site and you're looking at this bare piece of land and they're thinking, well, what's happening here? What are their rights? Where do they stand on this?
Very good question. The unitary plan is a lot more enabling than the previous district plans, and I think people will, in some cases, will get a shock as to the additional development potential, especially in that terrace house and apartment zone where you can go 4, 5 and sometimes 6 levels high. So you could be waking up one day having your cup of tea and the little old bungalow's gone, as you said, and it's going to be replaced with a 5-level apartment building. Generally speaking, in most cases, if that development complies with those development controls, it's going to be approved without your say. And what probably held up a lot of development under the previous plans was that people didn't really want development to happen in their backyards. They really wanted it to happen, but they didn't want it to happen in their backyards. And most backyards, the vast majority of Auckland, 80 to 90% of Auckland, there is development potential. There are some suburbs for character and heritage reasons that have been retained, some areas in Ponsonby, some areas in Devonport, some areas in Epsom, some areas in Parnell and Remuera, which have been retained for their special character and heritage. But the vast majority of the rest of the city, development can occur.
Yeah.
So there's that lovely word NIMBYism, not in my backyard. And I think we still get inquiry, probably on a weekly basis, where someone will come to us and say, this person has consent to build this, I'm outraged, I want to oppose it. So we'll often look at the plans, we'll see what's been approved around in the area, we'll see what we've recently had approved, and we'll probably write back a synopsis to them saying, you can complain, but you're not going to get anywhere. That paradigm shift, that mindset shift by the council to want development to happen, I suppose spaciousness as being a key driver of living in suburbia has been replaced by it's more important that people have housing, has tipped that balance. So once again, in the vast majority of cases, your complaints will fall on deaf ears, and what it also means is you could do the same yourself. So what you see can be reflected onto your site.
Yeah, there's a property that's halfway down Dominion Road, and it's actually the exact example of what we just discussed. There's this lovely little bungalow sitting there, and there's this massive concrete slab just rocketing into the sky. And I sort of looked at that and I thought, well, that person that's next door, they can stay in their bungalow, but they're not going to get any sun on that side of the house. So they effectively are going to be probably best to join in and sell up and move somewhere else if that is the case. So
in most cases, the site next door will also be zoned for high density. And you made that comment about the side wall being sort of blank and concrete. I'd often say wait till the buildings are finished,
yes.
Wait till the landscaping's gone in, and then wait till the developments happen next door and you end up with more of a wall of developments that are 4 or 5 levels high, and then it'll start to look normal. And I think that more and more people will say, this is the way to live. I can live in my apartment or terrace house, I can walk onto a main road, and the bus service will come every 10 minutes with a bus lane all the way into town. So we're probably going to get used to living with less reliance on the car because of our proximity to work and play.
That's interesting. So somebody can come to the Mount Hobson Group, they can ask what can be achieved with their plans and how can they maximise it. I always think, if you think dealing with an expert is expensive, wait till you deal with amateurs. And coming to someone like you, you're going to get quick, fast answers. And, the people we deal with on a daily basis, they want to know what can be achieved here. And obviously with the Mount Hobson Group, you're in a position to be able to give them a fairly good idea fairly fast.
The wonderful thing about the internet is that you've got the unitary plan online and you've got council's GIS, and very, very quickly we can make a very initial judgment on how many units you may get and whether there is an opportunity for development potential.
And as you mentioned just before, I guess if somebody's got something happening in their back, well, not in their backyard, but in their neighbour's backyard, and they want to check out whether is this completely 100% or what are my rights and options, they can talk to you as well.
Yeah, and you may not like what we've got to say, but I can provide you with a plethora of approvals which will be not much different from the one that's happening next door to you.
I tend to find a quick nose a lot less painful than a long-winded kind of discussion down at the council, and I'd rather get an answer quick, and then you start dealing with it. You go, oh well, I'm either going to join the game and we're going to go terraced housing, or I stay in my house and we wait and see what happens.
And generally speaking, what we think is going to be negative or adverse is not as bad once it's finished, once it's completed and once it's done.
Yeah, I must admit, you made that comment, and I go walking a lot, and you go past a half-finished house, and me and my wife have an argument about whether we do or don't like it, and I'm amazed by the time it's finished, the landscaping, and it's all been softened. You're kind of like, that's grown on me. So. Yeah,
and I think sometimes you've got to wait for the finished product. You've got to. We can all complain about building sites and portaloos and scaffolding and fencing. Let it all be finished. Let it blend back into the environment. And yep, some of those developments will look out of place initially, but that's the future.
So Hamish, my grandfather, who used to own the Newton Gully, used to say to me, Dale, you want a quarter acre, you want a big section, the kids want to run around. What's the chance of getting that now in Auckland?
I think what's more important is not so much the quarter acre, but owning a house. Whether that's an apartment or a terrace, it's about getting on the ladder. The unitary plan has pulled that ladder down to allow for people to get onto the first rung. So, 150 years ago, your great-great-grandfather probably told your grandfather to buy a farm. And then your grandfather told you to buy the 800 squares.
Yes.
What we're doing now is we're saying, let's get ourselves a house. Let's get ourselves on the ladder of property ownership. That's probably, to me, more important than the size of the section and the size of the house.
Absolutely. And I mean, I always think renting is like opening a window and just throwing money out the door, and you don't get that back. And living in a 2-bedroom nice place in Point Chev is obviously far more desirable, and like you say, you're on that ladder.
And the unitary plan allows for that price point to be lowered. It allows that first home buyer to get on that ladder and to get onto the property market. I think there's nothing better if the advice is own some land, own some property. That's got to be the advice of today.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for spending some time with Adding Value. This has been really valuable for me, and I'm sure the viewers are going to absolutely love it being demystified, and I've certainly learned a lot today. But obviously, if they want to ask more in-depth questions, your team is available. You can ring up, you can send an email, and you can make a request.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Cheers. Thank you.